Thousands of EFF supporters are expected to line the country's main roads this morning. We're now joined by Professor Sipho Seepe to get his views on today's protests. Professor, good morning and thank you very much for your time. It's somewhat calm this morning, contrary to what was expected by many, that indeed it would be a national shutdown. Your take on just what we're seeing this morning?
Well, there are a number of things that have occurred. One is that this being a Monday before a holiday, many workers had taken advantage of what would be a long weekend. We've also seen a number of universities also making this a university holiday, effectively meaning cutting down the number of people who will be very active. So the fact that you see less people moving, it's indicative of people who have always taken advantage of what may be a long weekend. So that is one part. And some people have said it was very clever for the EFF to do so, because it can also claim that non-reporting of many people, some of whom would have taken advantage of the four days, would be seen as a success. But secondly, what we also see is the absence of the level of violence that some people were predicting. But if one goes back, you'll also find that this is not the first time that the EFF has actually had a big march in our cities. And it had not resulted in the type of mayhem that people had. What people were looking at is to try to conjure the image of what happened in 2021. And today is actually very different. But what can be said is that most of the discussion has been more about the possibility of violence as opposed to the issues that the EFF wants to put on the table, which is actually unfortunate. We need to also understand that there's been a lot of commentary, which is really about affirming our democracy, that the right to protest is guaranteed by the Constitution and need to be respected. And the courts have also done so. And it is also strange that the people who have run to the courts are the very same people who themselves are used to calling for mass action.
But Professor, apologies for interjecting there, but is it not common cause that indeed those issues are legitimate? When we look at load shedding, everybody's experiencing it, and when we look at the unemployment numbers, they are untenable. So would there necessarily be a discussion around that when it seems across the media space we're seeing a lot of articles that agree that the issues are legitimate? They perhaps differ on just the methods used to bring about change, that perhaps it wouldn't result in any change but even further damage the economy.
Yeah, that's a very good point to put on the table, that whether this action or proposal and the protest as suggested by the EFF is a correct one. But what one needs to understand is that we must not conveniently forget that when you have such a crisis where the economy is not growing and is getting worse, where there's unemployment, where there's load shedding, then some people have to be blamed. And in this case, just like we had with Jacob Zuma, the people of this country or a number of organizations decided to say Jacob Zuma is a problem, and therefore they decided that he must go. So the EFF is saying, because of all those things that are a common cause, there is one person who must take responsibility. As a matter of fact, in many countries, presidents resign. And in this case, not only do we have a crisis of monumental proportion in all those areas, we also have a president who still has a case to answer. We cannot forget that the issue of Phala is still on the table, in the same way that the court in the past suggested when it came to Jacob Zuma that where there's a whiff of conflict of interest, the president has already erred on the side of the Constitution. So the EFF is saying, for the same arguments that were used to march against Jacob Zuma, those conditions persist and are even worse today.
But what of those who go on to say that should there not be teachings or something that we draw from history, that in many instances when you remove a leader, the problems remain? Because today they still talk of the state being captured, even though the former was removed. So is it really perhaps the solution, or they need to stop highlighting the problems, as advocate Tulima Donsela stated yesterday, that the problems are clear, everybody's in agreement, but perhaps just put solid solutions of how to go about changing these issues?
Well, one of the solutions is to remove a person who is at the center of this, a person who leads. It's called accountability. This is why in many countries, if you go to the UK, in a short space of time, you've had a number of prime ministers coming from the same party, but where there is a motion of no confidence that has been declared against the leader. So let us not try to undermine what is a simple democratic process that is available in democracies. Actually, in democracies that are mature, Cyril Ramaphosa would have walked out of the position without actually being pushed. You cannot be, as a former president Thabo Mbeki indicated, you cannot have business people carrying a lot of money and they claim to be successful business people, and that money is put in the coffers. You look at international media when it covered this, they know that in their own countries the president would have walked away. So let us not pretend that we're dealing with a case where there's normality. You have instances where interesting civil society organizations that were keen to talk about the rule of law, suddenly they have become quiet. So we have a democracy of a special kind. And when the EFF says we want to bring a basket of these things on the table, it is a proper and a legitimate issue. And some people were saying, well, it's political posturing, but all politicians are into that business. The ANC had its own march. Last week, Friday, there was not much noise. They marched to the ANC office. There was not all this noise. But what it says is that the EFF, because it brings all this basket of problems to the fore, and to say, we also have a president who in their own, they consider to be somebody who is criminal in a sense.
But some could argue, Professor, that with this particular march, they at least saw a number of images that were circulated of EFF leaders brandishing what looks like R5 rifles. Whether those were just images that some should ignore is something else, because some people were probably legitimately fearful that perhaps there's going to be some sort of violence, and maybe alerted the police that in instances such as these, we saw the DA marching, there were no visuals or images that were circulated ahead of their march, and the same thing with the ANC. There were no images circulated ahead of their march last week. So what does that mean?
Well, the court had ruled on the matter to say the right to protest is proper. And secondly, it had said the police, or not even the court, the government had said the police have a duty and law enforcement have a duty whenever they see people who are acting and in a manner that is illegal, that is not allowed. So what you need to do is that the might of the system, the law, must actually prevail. But what we cannot turn a blind eye to is that when you started now bringing the defense force, because there is a call for the president to step down, then what you are introducing is a very dangerous scenario where the defense force will start becoming an enemy of the people. The defense force are there to protect the people. And when we do that, because there's a political activity, and actually, as a matter of fact, the ANC issued a statement that said about the Eswatini that the use of the military force to deal with political issues does not add to the solution. And what we now have is what some people see as a provocation also from the side of the state. But what we now see, at least positively right now, is that the images that people had that were afraid of 2021, and those images are not there. And but at the same time, we also hope that the EFF marshals and leaders will also encourage their own people to desist from this level of violence that we sort of fear and some people anticipate.
But what can we attribute that level of calm to? Is it the presence of heavy police presence this morning and just their coordination and the briefings they had last week? Or it's just now, as you say, that the EFF displaying a level of discipline?
Well, I mean, it is all those factors. But at the same time, we must also say, you can have the police to deal with and issues of law enforcement. But once you start bringing the military into the place, then we're going back to apartheid days. Then you are also resolving your issues through, and brute force has not worked. But what is worse is that in the end, when all is said and done, the very institutions that are supposed to support this country will now be turned to be enemies of the people. And all this boils down to saying, all these forces must be marshaled because the EFF has called for the removal of a president, as if it has not been done before. It was done with Thabo Mbeki. It was done with Jacob Zuma. So we should also be able to isolate the issues and also the response, and not give the state a leeway in which it can just use their repressive apparatus to suppress a political agitation.
Professor, just before I let you go, I just want to get your views on a trend that we're seeing now. That's perhaps the vilifying of the black middle class. I read an article by Vianney Pambo this weekend where he seems to suggest that the black middle class are enabling an economically oppressive system for black people. Is that really a fair assessment to make if perhaps the black middle class are choosing to again criticize the method being used to deal with legitimate problems?
Well, one cannot come up with a blanket type of statement like that, because every class has complexities and differences. You have some people in the middle class who are co-opted to become part of the machinery of the oppressive system. We must also understand that we've also had union leaders who get co-opted into boards of companies, for companies that they spend time fighting against when those companies were exploiting black people. And when they get into those positions, they become the new junior partners of exploitation. So we do have that. But we do also have union leaders who continue to be steeped in the notion of worker rights. And within the black middle class, you also have people who get into positions. And when they get into those positions, they don't get into position to change the status quo. They become part of the problem. But that's why I'm saying that one cannot simply use one blanket. We must actually be nuanced in how we approach this to understand the complexity of being and the complexity of interest that are there.
All right, Professor, thank you very much for your insights this morning. That's political analyst Professor Sipho Seepe.